bush literature and city literature, all the things we have discussed in a nutshell. Similarly, we will come from general to specific concentration on Australian literature. So, as with any kind of literature, perhaps poetry becomes a kind of thing that comes to our mind. Uh, Poetry comes easily to mind. So, to our mind. So here we'll have a survey of 19th century Australian poetry in the beginning. So the first one uh, in uh, Captain Cook in 1770 discovered the route from England to Australia, landed at Botany Bay, named the whole of the east coast of Australia New South Wales, and took possession of it for Britain, because the influence of Britain in early Australian poetry was quite prominent. And on January 26th, 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip unfurled the Union Jack on the shore of Sydney Cove. The day is celebrated as Australia Day. He was appointed the first Governor General of the British settlement, which began as a penal colony with convicts and jailers transported from Britain. Hence, in the 18th century, there was no Australian literature. In this respect, Judith Wright has observed, quote, if there were men of a poetic tone among the convicts and soldiers of the first settlement, they had probably no time or inclination to exercise the gift. Mere survival and a fair share of the realm perhaps filled the only ambitions of the most. Unquote. So, the first poet laureate of Australia is Michael Massey Robinson. I repeat, Michael Massey Robinson. He was born in the year 1744, died in the year 1826. He was a convict who landed in Australia in 1805. In 1811, he obtained a pardon. He composed and published odes in Sydney Gazette to celebrate the birthday of George III and Queen Charlotte. In the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature, it is observed in 1818 and 1819, um, Robinson was repaid for his services as a poet laureate by a grant of 2 cows from the government herd, probably the first royalties to a poet in Australia. The next poet in Australia is Francis McNamara, he was born in the year 1811. He was also a convict, who is known as the composer of cheeky extempore verse. Along with convicts come some officers also penned verses. Notable among them is Baron Field, 1788, 1846, a judge of Supreme Court of New South Wales in 1819. The first book of Australian verse was published. Field chose the title Fast Fruits of Australian Poetry for the book to emphasize its primacy and historical importance. Wright points out that it, Fast Fruits, has the merit of being the first and for a long time the only verse produced in Australia which shows an interest in the local productions of flowers and animals. Unquote. W.C. Wentworth, 1793 to 1872 is the first native-born Australian to publish any verse, while at Cambridge in 1823 he composed the poem Australasia, which was a significant entry for the Chancellor's Prize for that year. So this poem Australasia is there also there in our course of study. We'll have detailed discussions when we come to the particular poet in detail. But here, he W.C. Wentworth becomes the man in man in reckoning for Australia because his poem Australasia has begun the indigenous trend for the first time in Australia. The first book of a poem to be published in Australia by a poet born in Australia is entitled Wild Notes from the Lyre of a Native Minstrel, 1823, published in the year 1823. The Charles Thompson the Charles Thompson uh, the poet is Charles Thompson, and the poem's name is Wild Notes from the Lyre of a Native Minstrel, 1823, Lyre, Lyre of a Native Minstrel. The most important of the early versifiers of Australia is Charles Harper, 1813 to 1868, who was the son of convict parents. He is the first Australian poet to take up the vocation of a poet seriously. He is the first poet who felt the moral compulsion to write Australian poetry. His published work include Thoughts, a series of sonnets, The Bush Rangers, a play in 5 acts, and other poems. The Tower of Dream, 1865, and several smaller works. A Broadsheet, Song of Australia, first series, pamphlet containing 2 poems entitled A Poet's Home, um, 1862, and a 4-page booklet, A Rhyme, 1864. The first Harper collected edition was the posthumous poems edited by H.M. Martin in 1883. According to the Oxford Companion to Australian Literature, Harper's ambition was to be Australia's first authentic poetic voice. Next important poet is Henry Kendall, 1839 to 1882. One significant fact about Kendall is that he was virtually the only Australian-born poet of his generation. He signed his poems H. Kendall, NAP, the initials standing for Native Australian Poet. So this is very significant, NAP or Native Australian Poet. So when we see Wentworth, there was no such claim of a native poet, but even if he has some signposts of indigenous poetry, but Henry Kendall became the earmarked native poet, Australian poet, and his published volumes were 3: Poems and Songs, 1862, Leaves from Australian Forest, 1869, and Songs from Mountains, 1880. His descriptive lyrics made Australia emerge as a tangible landscape in English poetry. Geoffrey uh, Shirley comments, quote, "It remains to be said that he was probably the best 19th century Australian poet who earned inclusion in Palgrave's Golden Treasury and the Oxford Book of English Verse." So here we come to know about the reputation of a poet, a native poet, native Australian poet. and Kendall, who has took the literature by surprise by concentrating fully on native poetry or aboriginal poetry or the poetry of bush, all the things. Then we come to know about an expatriate poet, Adam Lindsay Gordon. He arrived in Australia in 1853 and remained there till he committed suicide in 1870. In 1864, he published the ballad, The Feud, Feud, Feud. In 1867, he published Ashtaroth. His poetic reputation, however, rests on the poems published in two volumes, Sea Spray and Smoke Drift, and Bush Ballads and Galloping Rhymes. Brian Eliot points out nothing in all colonial poetry matches in importance Gordon's signal achievement, the fixation of the Australian image. So, in in depicting the Australian image or the indigenous roots and the myth, Gordon becomes the first to do that, or Gordon is rated high as far as depicting Australian image is concerned. With the launch of the most significant Australian literary journal, Bulletin, in 1880, a movement for nationalism in Australian literature was initiated. The impact of this is most felt in the poetry of Abby Patterson, 1864 to 1941. Patterson is also known as Banjo, as he used that pseudonym for his early contributions to Bulletin. His first volume of poems entitled The Man from Snowy River and Other Verses sold out in the week of its publication. And it went through six editions in 6 months. His ballads about drovers, teamsters, bush rangers, picnic race meetings, and animosity between squatterers and drovers made him a very popular poet. His other books of poems appeared in the 20th century um, Australian literature. So H.M. Green highlights his signal contribution to Australian poetry. Quote, Patterson, more than any other balladist, more indeed than any other Australian writer of verse, conveys to us the atmosphere of the Australian countryside and its inhabitants. So the indigenous element is quite high in Patterson's poetry. Then we come to know about the most notable Australian poet, Ada Cambridge. We'll read about her in detail also. She was born in the year 1844 and died in 1926. She published her most important book of poems on spoken thoughts, 1887, anonymously. Patricia Barton mentions the themes of her poetry as follows. Quote, unspoken thoughts expresses indignation at social and sexual injustice, longings for love and sexual expression, explorations of motherhood, fear of death and this agony of illness, and a challenging of conviction and orthodox beliefs. So this is when no women poet were in the scene. Now, no women poet was in the scene. She came to uphold the values of women, and she tried to uphold the values of feminism in Australian literature for the first time. So, in a sense, she can be called as a trendsetter in the women's poetry in Australia. So, in analyzing Australian poetry, we have come to a a conclusion that the impact of British poetry is very, very prominent in early Australian poetry. And the history of Australian poetry from the first settlement in 1788 until the end of the First World War is largely a story in the adaptation of the European and especially English poetic consciousness and tradition to entirely new and apparently hostile conditions. So the hostile conditions and the new conditions that were prevalent in Australia has been compromised or compensated by the English or the British influence, which made Australian poetry possible. For the first time, the adaptation of English poetic diction of Britain is markedly apparent in the poetry of the early versifiers of Australia. For example, the following lines by M. Robinson immediately echoes the metrical rhythm of the heroic couples used by Pope and poets of the 18th century in Britain. We want to quote a short stanza. Quote, while his proud natives aid the subject main, and now discoveries marked his glorious reign, reviews the smiling dawn of opening youth, when mutual virtue pledged connubial truth. Now here comes the mutuality between British and the Australian settlement, where something that was not available in Australia, a kind of cultural aspect or the higher kind of intellectual aspect, was primarily British in nature, whereas the roots and the culture and other things that were is required for poetry, the tradition, all the things comes from Australia exclusively. So that is why the mutual virtue here means both the sides get good results out of this. So this is in this way the poetry proper in Australia, in Australian literature came into being. Then we have so many other poets, and um, we will now concentrate on the flora and fauna of Australia, how the land and landscape of Australia has influenced the early Australian poetry in a great way. That is the point of our discussion now. Uh, the imitativeness apart, the imitativeness of British poetry apart, what we find new in Australian poetry is the mm, English language helps to explore the Australian flora and fauna. So this is something quite interesting. That means the language is English, nothing else is English. The culture, the flora and the fauna, the land and the landscape, the geographical conditions, the torrid, cold, all these things, the bone healing cold, all these things were typically Australian in nature. The emotional imperative of both the expatriate and the native-born poets of Australia of this period find a literary reflection in the reoriented vocabulary and idiom of this innovative poetry. Distinctively, the flora and fauna of Australia, as reflected in the poetry, give it an indigenous color and flavor. Uh, Bentworth's Australasia mentions and depicts the local space as in the following lines, but it does not incorporate the typical Australian flora and fauna. Here, quote, here lowing kine, These bounding courses graze. Here babes the corn, and there the woody maize. Here the tall peas puts forth its pinky bloom, and there the orange scatters its perfume. Warrenfield mentions kangaroo as the spirit of Australia, as Judith Wright observes. Botany Way Wildflowers Fields poem is appreciatively of the flora and of the sandstone near Sydney, which had sent banks into professional stasis. Then Harper's promise to be the bard of thy country, quote unquote, bard of thy country, manifests itself in his vivid description of the land, though he made efforts in his poetry to recreate the landscape of Australia. Australian solitude and desolation are very sensitively evoked in the following lines. Not a bird disturbs the air. There is quiet everywhere on our plains and our woods. What a mighty stillness broods. So here is the description of countryside that gives the peace of mind to the poet. Similarly, the long poem, The Creek of the Four Graves, is full of description of natural landscape. However, he did not try to incorporate any typical Australian flora and fauna, and though Lost in the Bush mentions kangaroo and bidwongs, and so here, this is about flora and fauna of Australia, how it is reflected in Australian poetry. Things, description about kangaroo, description about bush, description about the indigenous roots are very much prominent here. Then we'll come to discuss about colonial setting and sentiment. So, as we have already discussed, that colonial setting or colonial influence is very much felt in Australian poetry, early Australian poetry especially. During the 19th century, Australia was a British colony. Hence, the poetry that was written during the colonial century in Australia bears the mark of colonial influence and colonial thinking. The adoration of the British Empire, the kings and the queens, the British colonial officers, the transplanted culture, and the upholding of the white civilization permeate the themes and attitudes expressed in the colonial poetry of Australia. Wentworth's poem Australasia epitomizes the glorification of Britain and the celebration of the colonization of Australia in the following lines. And Australasia um, wrote with a flag unfurled, a new Britannia in another world. Gradually, however, the tendency towards nationalism gathered force, and by the end of the century, Australian poetry got rid of inferiority complex and moved towards a robust sense of pride and in the country, her people, and their achievements. Patterson's poetry registers this change. Then the Australian roots and Australian identity has become very prominent here as a prominent major theme in Australian literature. So homesickness, then initial surprise and disgust with the strange and uncouth landscape, and seasonal variations of the antipodes, um, because it is when it is summer in Britain, it is winter in Australia, and sense of alienation and displacement gradually gave way to the development of a growing sense of attachment to the land. People of different states come together and formed the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. During the whole of 19th century, the process of integration and development of Australian identity is very much in the making. The identification of the Australian flora and fauna, the bush life, mateship, horsemanship, and other features that characterize the Australian identity find a continual reflection in the 19th century Australian poetry. The poetry of Harper, Kendall, Gordon, Patterson, and Cambridge reflect the development of Australian identity. So, with this, we come to conclude today's discussion. And in the next class, we will continue with the poetry. Then we will come to discuss Australian drama, early Australian drama, and early Australian novel. Thank you. Thank you very much.